So what I'll do is begin by giving you some ideas about what we do. We're an aeolian geomorphologist. So aeolian is the study of wind, processes of wind and so forth. So this photograph that you see here is actually taken from northern Quebec. I didn't check the distance. It's probably a good 2,000 kilometers north of where we are right now. So if you go to the St. Lawrence, go north to a place called Shefferville, you need a plane to get there. Then you get into a small plane and you fly again to a caribou camp. And then you get into a helicopter. And by the way, the helicopter is there. And that will get you here. But if you're familiar with the Overlook Dune, and you look carefully at this dune, there are very strong similarities between the Overlook Dune, which is the dune that's just directly behind us here, and this dune. What do we see? We see a dune, we've referred to it as parabolic. It's just that particular shape. I'm going to move off. I know people on the screen won't necessarily see me. I'm going to move to the side for a moment to show a few things. This dune is climbing over dune here. It's got a dune behind it. The Overlook Dune is also doing the same thing. It's climbing over sand in front of it, and it has a dune behind it. You see these gray, dark gray areas? That's not sand. That's gravel. It represents the original material of which the sand is feeding and taking, or the dune is taking sand from it through the wind processes to form that dune. You will also notice trees on the side and lots of plants. It's because when it rains, this actually results in a lot of moisture accumulation. It elevates the groundwater table and essentially feeds the vegetation around it. So again, when you go to the Overlook Dune and you're looking at all that forest and vegetation around it, it's actually a lot of similarities between the two. The other thing of interest is this dune is moving over a surface, which is clearly not a sand dune. It's the original substrate. So it means that the wind processes actually result in relatively thin accumulations of sandy dune sediments. They're actually eroding right on that original source material. So although this is 2,000 kilometers north of us, it is very similar to what we see here in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve in terms of the origins of the dunes. So this is very similar, except for the water, as to what you might have thought the dunes may have been like here. So aeolian processes, that's what I study. It's the erosion, the transport, the deposition of particles by wind. Those particles could include the sediment, like sand, or organic materials like peat or dirt and dust, plastics, ice and snow, or even like pollution contaminants and this sort of thing from smelters. All those things represent that can be carried by the wind are parts of an aeolian process. And I'm just showing a picture of the sort of dynamics of wind and the motions of the wind and the transport of the sand through a small dune area that happens to be in the Great Plains. And with aeolian processes, I'm an aeolian geomorphologist, which means the shapes of things on Earth, which are created by the processes of wind. And these are the landforms that are the result of sediment transport by wind, which could be dust, which produces what we call loess. These are like, there's one set of people that love to study the accumulation of just fine silt and clay, all right? And there are, China, for example, there's lots of loess accumulations. Actually, there's lots of loess accumulations also in the United States. But the area that I do is I study sand. And maybe this is why. Sand's fun, right? So this is White Sands. Have any of you been to White Sands before? Yeah, it's fantastic. It's really cool. This was just last summer, in fact. Of course, these are all scientists going off the edge. And those happen to be gypsum deposits or gypsum sand. Yeah. Now, in the bigger picture, if you were to go and look at a map of dunes and sand seas across the world, more often than not, that map is going to look like this. And we see dunes in Australia, Africa, South America, in China. You notice that the United States, you see Nebraska sandhills, and this line that I've drawn here is this separation between all the arid and semi-arid regions and cold regions. And most maps, like this one, show no dune fields in cold regions. And I'll tell you why. It's because these dunes are easy to see. You can get in a dune buggy and you can go across them. You can see those dunes. You can see them from an airplane. You can see them from satellite imagery. But the dunes that are in these cold regions, they're hard to see. You know, imagine even the Pine Bush Preserve covered in forests, this sort of thing. People won't know they're there. I don't know if you're familiar with the Rome Dunes or the Saratoga Springs, the sand plains. They're not easy to identify. They're not easy to see. And as a result, they've been less studied. We still don't know the full distribution of cold climate dune fields. And so it's a relatively very underrepresented contribution to the global landscape. Dune forms. There are a variety of dunes that are formed in those hot desert environments. Okay, we give them names. There's these Barkan dunes. That happens in low sediment supply. And as the supply of sand gets bigger and bigger, they'll migrate into what we see here as transverse dunes. The accumulations are getting thicker and thicker. And then that's under uniform winds, if you just have one wind direction. But if the wind directions become more complicated, more complex, we get different types of dunes that form. We call them linear dunes, reversing dunes, and even star dunes. Now, Kelso sand dunes, that's in California. Great example. There's 3 wind directions, and the sand just starts to pile up higher and higher and higher into a big mound. It's almost like it has nowhere to go except up. And the largest dunes that we see are in these complex wind directions. Those are arid dunes, okay? Those are dunes that form in desert environments. Now, the figure that I'm showing on the left, which is Canada and the United States, the big white area is the last glaciation. So essentially all of Canada and a reasonable proportion of the United States was covered by glacier ice until about 24,000 years ago. And in fact, in the eastern United States, that glacier ice made it as far as New York City. So if you're in New Jersey, it did not get that far, which is, I've studied sand dunes down in that area. But so what you'll see here are here's the Nebraska sand dunes here. And these are all the other dune fields that you see, and even up into Alaska, which is unglaciated, that are part of that global system of dunes that largely go unrecognized. And almost all of those dunes take on a different form than the one that I just mentioned, and it's called the parabolic dune. So this is the dune here, and they are essentially associated with moisture and vegetation. So they produce a particular shape. If the wind is blowing from the left to right, or whatever, the head of the dune is here. So you can tell the direction of the wind by that particular dune. essentially the dunes form that shape. It can get a little more complicated, but very few people recognize that complication. Just say that we do get the same types of winds in different directions, and they form very unique features, but for all intents and purposes, it's the parabolic dune that represents those cold climates. All right. Now, this is the active form, and again, this is the stabilized form. I've shaded it out. It's hard to see. Like I said, it's hard to see these features. And so, like I said, they generally go unrecognized throughout the cold climate regions in the Northern Hemisphere. This is the shape of those dunes. And here's an example then. You can see now, this is the classic feature that we see, the head of the dune, the arms, and they're all migrating in that direction. All right, that's generally Albany. Again, this is from that same region, a good 2,000 kilometers north of us. This figure that's not showing is because we've switched to the Mac instead of the other computer. Nevertheless, hopefully the rest are going to be okay. What we do, what we study the shape of the dunes. That's the morphology. The shape of the dune, like I just was talking about, this parabolic form, it helps, we can understand what direction the winds moved in the past by identifying that shape. It's essentially pointing the wind direction. We can understand how much sediment there is, the controls that vegetation have. We can also look into the dune, look at that stratigraphy. It'll tell us about the transport processes. Has the dune always been stable, or has it been stable or reactivated over time? We look at the age of the dunes, and I'll explain how we do that. We do that to understand, for example, in the western states in Canada, what were the big droughts in the past? We can figure out when there was a large drought by looking at the age of these dunes that occurred in the past, finding out when there were periods of significant dry periods in the past and other climate changes. We look at the mineralogy, and we look under the microscope at the shapes of the dune, of the sand grains, to determine things about their transport history and where the sand grains actually came from. Hopefully we'll just see how this goes. We use remote sensing. You could use air photos, satellite imagery, and something called LiDAR. There's a few people nodding their heads. So it's use an airplane, but basically gives you very, very high resolution topography of the landscape down to the centimeter level. And almost all of the United States has now been covered, and Pine Bush Preserve is one of those areas. And you'll see some imagery from that. We use geophysics. Typically we use radar, which will penetrate the ground and allow us to look at what sediments are underneath the ground and what their stratigraphy is, or basically their structure. And we did that here. We also date using radiocarbon, which some people will be familiar with. You know, you take some wood and you can date how old the wood is. The other thing that I've done with my colleagues is date the last time that sand grains were exposed to sunlight. All right. So just think about that. That's, if you can date when something was exposed to the sun in the past, that's a very, very useful technique. And that method can date things as old as 300,000 years. Can you elaborate on that? Yes, at the end when you ask the question, because it's a very neat technique. And then just looking at particle size, grain shape will tell us a fair bit about the way in which those grains have changed over time. And I'll just leave the mineralogy. Look, photos are back. Yay. So you are all familiar with this. So this is the Overlook Dune. It's not so easy to see, the shape of it here, but this path, the main path outlines that parabolic shape. All right. You walk that, you're walking the top of the dune. So if it outlines the shape, which way did the wind blow? Actually, not quite, but if you're going from here to here, you're correct. It happens to be from the northwest, but yeah. And as I said, again, I'm going to move off the screen here for a moment. There's another dune back here. See that one? And we climbed over this, and then the Overlook Dune is actually climbing over another dune in front of it over. If you go and walk the trails and look at it another time, you'll see those things there. So the questions that we have that we'll try to answer tonight are, how did the dunes form? When did they form? And how long were they active? Fairly simple questions. And I would say the answers appear to be relatively straightforward in the end. What you see here then is just an image of the whole region. You see the Adirondack Mountains, Albany down in the southeast. The orange are all dune fields. Okay, so probably a little more than you thought. I don't know, you're probably familiar with the town of Rome, but maybe didn't know that there were dunes there. And up in Saratoga. And the Saratoga area, it's quite extensive. Very, very interesting. And then north, Saranac Lake. Lots of dunes, both on the New York side and on the Ontario side in the St. Lawrence lowlands. Lots. There's reasons for these. All the dunes have their own story in terms of origins, why they exist. They do exist for different reasons, okay? In the St. Lawrence lowlands, there was a very large sea, saltwater sea that came in after the glaciers. It was called the Champlain Sea. And those sands were a product of the deposition within the sea. And when they receded, those dunes formed. And then you can see lots of other dunes off further up into Canada. And like I say, each one has its own story in terms of how it formed and what it tells us. And at the end, I'll try to give you a bigger picture again. This is new. Obviously, Saratoga, Albany, Rome, they've been known about, but those ones in Saranac Lake, those are really new. We just only found them by looking at the LiDAR, finding them. And colleagues, Brian Carl, who's up in, and David Franzi, one fellow in Potsdam, the other fellow in Plattsburgh, have spent a lot of time mapping these dunes and finding them essentially for the first time. So again, on the one side is this picture of Canada, the United States, and that white is the glacier. These blue lines for the figure on the right-hand side shows the time when that ice receded, when it started to move northward. So what it tells us then is that here at the bottom it says 15,000 years ago. What that means is that down in Rome and Saratoga, that area, Albany's here, the glacier moved northward 15,000 years ago. So the dunes could be as old as 15,000 years. Now, the thing is, of course, there was a glacial lake. It's glacial lake Albany. So we have to wait then for that water to disappear before the dunes could actually form. Same with Rome. So again, every dune has its own story in terms of what the deposits are that come, when the when they become exposed to the air and when they can start to move. And as we go northward, the dunes get younger and younger, all right? And this is this sea that I mentioned, the Champlain Sea. And again, the origins of all these dunes have to do with this inland sea that formed after the glaciers receded. You can ask me later why it formed. I'd be happy to answer that question. So again, locally, you see this, it says APBP, that's the Albany Pine Bush Preserve, right here. And this is about 16,000 years ago. That's called the Hudson, I think it's the Hudson Mohawk Lobe. That's the part of the ice. So again, we have Glacial Lake Albany. We have the ice sheet. It's covered. Clearly, our dunes cannot form at 16,000 years ago. However, around 14,000, the ice is gone, the waters have receded, and we're on what we refer to as the Mohawk Delta. Water that was running essentially from the Great Lakes through Rome, came down towards the southeast into this region, depositing sands. And so a combination of Glacial Lake Albany, which deposited lake sediments, and these river sediments were the source, potential source of materials to form our dunes in the Albany area. And of course, remember, we also have the up here in the area and up here in Saratoga. So the Saratoga ones are going to be young. That's about 14,000. So I have a couple of maps to show. This is the geology, superficial geology, the sediments that are on the surface in the Albany Pine Bush area. All the red that you see, those are dunes. A colleague of mine, actually a student, mapped every little dune right here to show that particular area. So important things about the color here. That's this sort of light brown. Those are referred to as aeolian or windblown sand. The red are the well-developed dunes. The blue are lake sediments. So the whole area is essentially surrounded by, and the dunes have formed on, these lake sediments. Those lake sediments being the Glacial Lake Albany. I'm going to show another map now, which is a little older, and I tend to like it. It's simpler. Shows the Pine Bush dune field. The pink is the lake sediments, and the orange here are these more gravelly, sandy sediments. And so it's saying that the origins of these sands are related to the Glacial Lake Albany, and this influx of those river sands that I mentioned were coming from the Great Lakes. Just some figures. Again, like I said, it's not easy to see dunes, is it? Can anyone spot any sand dunes here? So here's where we are. We're right here. So I mentioned this LiDAR, this high resolution topography that we can use that allows us to sort of start to see the shapes of things. And this is what it looks like. I'll just go back and forth. There's the blue dot for the Pine Bush Preserve. And again now. You see the shapes? You see those parabolic dunes? They're easy to see. And I've shown a few white arrows that show the direction from the west, northwest to east, southeast. And very consistent through the whole area. There's the landfill, obvious. This is the Overlook Dune right here. And it's, to me, it's beautiful. So we're just going to zoom in a little closer. Again, the blue dot is the interpretive center, and there's the Overlook Dune. The white and the red is just showing elevation. So the white is the highest elevation, red is intermediate, and the green is the low elevation. Some interesting things here. The dunes are well formed. Some of you might notice something interesting here. A lot of little circles down here. Yeah, those. So we pondered about that. What could have formed those small circles? Could that be evidence of reactivation of dunes? We think it would have been caused by people. It either was ATVs or it was extraction. And in fact, to understand too, early Aboriginal use also made futures like these. So we don't know exactly what's formed those, but it could have been all three of those because they get reused and reused until we start to, preserve those landscapes. But that's very rare. We don't see that. More like the Overlook Dune. What we see are well-formed dunes that seem to, not have any indication of having been disturbed over time. Nice photograph. For those of you that have walked that trail and are familiar, I just wanted to sort of give you an idea of what I see. So from the west to the east, you'll see it comes up a nice gentle slope and then drops down the other side. That's typical of the dunes, as the sand grains are bouncing, saltating up from the west and then dropping over the edge on the other side, right? So that gives us an indication of the direction of sediment transport and of the dunes. This photograph, you may know that this was burned just last May. This was when it was burned maybe 3 or 4 years previous to that. So this is actually not from this season, but earlier. Just shows the frequency of reburning in the area. And again, now, where I'm just looking directly, remember I mentioned that the Overlook Dune had another dune behind it. There's the dune there. And again, just the direction to get an idea of what we see or what I see when I'm walking on the dunes in the Overlook Dune. So what did we do? So first thing we did was to go to 5 different sites and core. So we use an auger, a hand auger, and I'll just show you what we do. And we go as deep as we can, typically to the water table. The second dot, again, I'm going to move away from the screen for a sec. This dot here, that's clearly on the Overlook Dune. The one that's closer to the Y, it's in an interdune area. It's down in the low area. And then we're going to go down sort of the back of the Overlook Dune progressively. We're going to collect samples. We're going to look at their color. We're going to look for organics. We'll look for grains. We're going to sample the last time sand grains were exposed to sunlight. We're going to figure some things out about how does it relate to what we think we know already and the age of the dunes.
Quick question.
Yes.
Along the same lines, can you tell about their migration pattern over, say, 1,000 years? Whether it moves 100 yards?
How fast? You're asking how fast did the dune move, right?
You see that before that. Or how do you figure that out?
Theoretically, you can figure it out. And that is an area of discussion of a lot of people that are trying to figure these things out. All I can say for sure is it probably was moving between 1 and 5 meters per year. And I'm only saying that based on the rate of dune migration that I've seen in places where the dunes are moving. About 1 meter to 5 meters per year. So we have a scale here, and that would suggest that maybe this is 50 meters. So it shouldn't take too long for that dune to turn over, right? So the entire dune could move an entire wavelength all the dune, all the sand on that dune could be moved another dune length within 100 years. All right.
And then re-exposed to-
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, but what's very interesting is the only part of the dune to move is the front of the dune. Okay. See these long parts here? We call them the arms. They stayed there. They stayed where they were. So if you wanted to find out how fast a dune moves, you could take a sample from here, take a sample from here, and date the difference theoretically, all right? And you could figure out how fast the dune was actually moving. And, you know, people do those things. That's a good question. So you saw that line, it said Y to X. This is the same thing. This is that dune. So there's the Overlook Dune. And those are each of the boreholes that we took, 1 through 5. You see one is, and each of these high points, they're dunes. There's a little dune in front of the Overlook Dune. There's the Overlook Dune, and there's another one behind it. All right. And so that's as far as we augured. We're not the first people to do this. It's been augured before, or the borehole before, even deeper than we've gone. But getting down 5 meters is pretty good. And the stars are where we sampled to get the age of the dune. All right. And we actually collect, you'll see in a moment, we collected sample, or we came up and we brought up samples at about 6 to 8 inches at a time. And you'll see. I'll show you what I mean by that. We collect the sample and we put it on a nice white tarp, and we can look at it. And it's important to look at what you're bringing up. The color can tell you something, if there's organics in there, and it gives us an opportunity to sample. So this was the sample. See the circle for number 1? That's in the interdune area. You might be familiar with the trail below the Overlook Dune there. This is, there's Neil Gifford doing all the work. Here he is again. And that's at the top of the Overlook Dune. And moving down to the side. See, that gives you a good idea. We're putting all the samples out, and then we specifically subsample. You'll notice on the tarp, there's a container right here, a little black container. So that's where we will have taken a sample to figure out the date, the age of the sample. But it's important to lay it all out because you might find a buried soil. So again, soils usually look dark because they have organic matter in them. And if you find a soil down below, then it says, hey, hold on, this dune was active and then it stopped for a while and then it moved again. But we didn't see any of that. And Neil again doing all the work. Thank you to Neil. So again, as I said, we looked at the organic content that tells us about if there's buried soils. We look at the soil color. Do we actually look at the particles themselves, the size, the shape, and the mineralogy? And as I said, we'll date the last time they were exposed to sunlight. So we have colleagues in Poland that specifically look at sand grains. And I'm just going to simplify what they saw in general. If you look at the top 3 slides, and each of these, you see these bars? That's half a centimeter. From one black line to another is 1 millimeter. All right. So take a look at the size of those grains compared to that. We're talking about grains that are not even a quarter of a millimeter in size. You look along the top at those grains and you can get a feel for their size. They're typically less than a quarter of a millimeter. Small. Well, and they're all very similar. the ones at the top, those were taken from the Overlook Dune. The ones at the bottom were taken from those low areas. Okay, like at number 1, and again farther over in borehole number 4. There, the one on the left here, there's really small grains, but then there's some big grains too. And the other ones, they're all kind of messy. They're all over the place. Some are big, some are small. And the other thing we notice is that they're not really as clean looking. I mean, yeah, sure, they're yellow, but start to look at the grains. They have coatings on of silt. Kind of, they're dirty, not like these dune sands. So the top 3 indicate to us that this was blown by wind, because it's hard for wind to blow grains like that are heavy and big. And so you typically get well-sorted grains. They're also typically clean because they're being impacted. The ones at the bottom don't look like wind-blown sands, right? Again, as you might remember, the source of these sands are lake sands and delta sands. So it's suggesting to us almost immediately that there's not a very thick cover of wind-blown sand. Remember that photograph I showed you at the beginning of that dune that was way up in Quebec? And I said how it was going over a surface that didn't have much wind-blown sand? Well, the Overlook Dune is like that too. That it's moving on a surface that's not part of those wind-blown sands. These numbers that you see, 155, 505, 245, that's how deep we were below the surface, right? So in the middle one at the top, PH2 505, that's 5 meters or, that's gotta be 20 feet below the ground. And we still have really nice dune sands. All right. Things that from a perspective that we look at their color, yellowish brown, very fine. Like I said, it's 1/4 to 1/8 of a millimeter. They're moderately sorted. There is a range of size. Look how glassy some of them look, right? They're really shiny and glassy. That's quartz. So they have a fairly high, about 70% it says is a fairly high quartz content, but we have lots of other little minerals here. Those other minerals reflect sources from the Adirondack Mountains, from glaciation, and also sources that are more local, which are not igneous rocks, but sedimentary rocks, okay, that are more local. And as you can see here, it says 98% sand. So there's just a little bit of silt, a little bit of particles that are smaller than sand grains. That's the dune sand. For what it's worth, because I've been to Timbuktu, this is what a desert sand looks like. All the sizes of the sand. It's 100% sand. It's at least 99% just quartz. Why just quartz? Because quartz is hard compared to the other minerals, and the other minerals decay and break apart and blow away over time. So that's what a sand looks like from a desert. I'll just go back one. This is what the sands look like here in the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. A little more angular compared to these, and not quite as perfect. This is the interdune, very fine because it's deposited in a low energy lake environment.
Clearly fluid, would it be buried in silt or is it separated out of?
Yeah, if there was loess or dust, we could find it accumulated in parts of some of the grains. Yes. Yeah, and again, when we saw some of that, it's a good point. Some of it could be, one or the other. Yeah. I think most of the dust went to the Atlantic Ocean or somewhere further. And again, here's again that really messy looking stuff in the intervening area. The grains are dirty looking. You notice a lot of black. So there's a higher proportion of grains like feldspars and others that are not those quartz grains. All right. And it's poorly sorted. Yeah. And again, just the other one as well. I just want to sort of emphasize those different types that are there. So like I said, our colleagues actually take these, look at them under the microscope. And this is what grains that have been transported by wind for a long time look like. So you see the one on your left, long duration sand dune and shorter duration. So as they're jumping up, hitting the ground and splashing and moving the next one, over time, they get well-rounded like that. These are not from the Albany Pine Bush Preserve. All right, ready? This is what they look like. So my colleagues in Poland who did this work, they call me and they say, those aren't sand dunes. These are not dunes. These are not Aeolian sand grains. So, and it's like, well, I can assure you, I'm pretty sure that these are dunes. So what does this tell us right away? Remember, we said here, long duration, short duration. This means very short duration. These grains have actually inherited their shape from being ground up in a glacier and moved along in a river and put down the ground. They have not inherited their shape from the wind because it did not happen for very long. So it was the first indication that the processes that form these dunes didn't do it for very long.
Would they argue that it's more gravel?
Pardon me?
Would they argue that it's more like gravel or go further west, more gravelly?
Well, gravel is a size thing, so it's hard to say more gravelly, but yeah. And what were you saying as well?
Do you know what the highlighted boxes represent? As well?
Oh, sorry, thank you. The highlighted boxes, which I didn't show, they zoom in and look at it in even higher magnification. All right, so I just left it at that for you to see the broad shape, but they love to get right in there and look at these things. Oh yeah. No, seriously, yeah, they do like this stuff. So this is impact, right? But this is grinding impact. This is a one grain being pushed and ground against another one. Type of thing that happens, like I say, when you're in a glacier or something and you're just moving stuff along and making it small. And then when you get into a river and they start moving, it starts to move those edges. So over time, if this was blown for a while, all those edges would smooth out. The other thing that we had though is the sand grains here in Albany, they're small. The size of these grains is smaller than the average size of grains that you find in desert dunes, right? And that means something too. You're driving down the highway and there's a big truck and there's a little car. The big truck, I mean, it has a lot of momentum, right? That little car doesn't have much. These little sand grains do not have a lot of momentum. So when they impact another grain, they don't do a lot to them, all right? And so it would take more effort to change the shape over time, right? So how old is the dune? And right, they're all there. So these are our ages, and they're in thousands of years. So you see the 11s and the 12s and the 13s, and there's a 10. So let's just average that out. Typically, I think essentially what we see, the Overlook Dune, the top of the dune, we're down 20 feet or so, it's 11,000 years old. For all intents and purposes, I would say these dunes stabilize. This is when they stopped moving. About 11,000 years ago. the older dates, the 13, the 12 that you see, those are dates of sands that did not originate, like they're not dune sands. They're the river sands. So it means that we have a time period. So the dunes formed somewhere between 13 and 11,000 years ago. Okay, so there's about a window of maybe 2,000 years, and I would say maybe 1,500 years that the dunes actually moved. And then they stop. This is also 11 over here. And I've noticed this too. If you have some of you walked the trails of, like, do you know the Pine Bush now quite well? If you go and look at the areas that are disturbed, over towards the west here, that has been recently ripped out and it's been seeded, you will notice that rainwater and snowmelt causes sand to move down and fill in the interdune areas. Right? You actually get, and so these areas in here would actually have been like little streams or ponds that were accumulating sand that in this area. So both of these are happening at the same time. Just to point out that sort of there's different processes that are going on, but essentially the time that the dune is active is until about 11,000 years ago. Yeah. So with that in mind, a few more things we did. We have a machine here. It's radar. It allows us, because you want to be able to see what the dune looks like but you know, if you can't, you use this. So we dragged it over these different white areas, the interdune areas, and the dune themselves. And you can sort of see, so this yellow is interpreted as dune sands. And we have a fairly thick dune sands in the Overlook Dune area. And in fact, this is just the depth of interpretation. It's probably thicker than, okay? Again, if we go back just quickly a little bit here, you're seeing here, so that's, say that's 10, 13 meters. So we have almost 15 meters of sand, okay, which is, I'm gonna just guess that's good, 45 feet. All right, 40, 50 feet of dune. Which is more than we can actually penetrate with this. Again, too, though, this is just showing the dune sands. This is what's interesting is, again, I mentioned the older dates. This blue is the lake sands. The dunes are just traveling over a different material. So it's quite thin. That's uninterpretable. It's like after that, it can not read any further down. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And again, too, that's the interdune area, and really shows that we do not have a thick dune sands between them. So we're getting to near the end of the talk here. The white and the red can be interpreted as those dune sands. The green would be what the dunes are traveling over. Those lake sands, the glacial Lake Albany, this sort of thing. And at the end of the day, although they've been here for 11,000 years, they haven't moved in that time period. And that's significant. It's very interesting. One of my colleagues recognized the fact that you can find stone tools from First Nations on dunes. If they were buried by the sand, then that would have meant that the sand had been reactivated. But you're going to find them on the surface. And that's indeed what has happened for the most part. So the dunes are derived from those glacial lake sediments and delta sediments that were deposited when those waters drained from glacial Lake Albany. The grain shape I showed you, it's not well rounded. They have a high percentage of grains that are actually not quartz. They have feldspars in them as well. and indicates that those dunes did not travel very far. And Greg asked that question already, how far did they go and how fast did they go? They have been sorted by the wind, but the sediments themselves, like I say, our Polish friends were going, these aren't dunes